And as I guess it has already been said, I'm Matteo Busi. I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Pisa. And today I'm going to talk about the fox and the hound and how can we compare fully abstract and robust compilation, and how can we reconcile these two notions in an abstract way. This is a joint work with Carmine Abate and Stelios Tsapas, who is also in the audience. Okay, cool. Sorry, I'm missing a few things. Okay, so let's start. And let's start with an explanation of what a secure compiler is. And intuitively, a secure compiler is a compiler that does not introduce any security-relevant bugs, right? So, in other words, is a compiler that preserves security properties of the source program. And the problem here is that with this intuitive notion of compiler security, we don't have a rigorous formal definition of security. So with this informal definition is a bit unsatisfactory. So during the years, people came up with different notions for secure compilers. And the first notion for a secure compiler is full abstraction, fully abstract compilation. And the idea there is to express security via contextual equivalences. So security is expressed in terms of indistinguishability with respect to an attacker, which is modeled through a context, so a program within whole. And usually it is stated as follows. So we have this definition here in which we say, okay, we take two programs, P1 and P2, and if these two programs are not distinguishable according to any attacker at the source, this CS here, then it must be true that these two programs, when compiled, so P1 compiled and P2 compiled, are not distinguishable according to any attacker at a target level. And this should also be true also in the vice versa case, so from the red part to the blue part. And we say that a compiler which is written like these double brackets here is secure if it preserves and reflects equivalences. And fully abstract compilation, so we have preservation, and reflection, and reflection is rather easy and is usually subsumed by compiler correctness. But the other side, the preservation side, is actually a way of expressing security. And fully abstract compilation has been used to show preservation of confidentiality, of well-bracketed control flow, of local state encapsulation in a variety of different settings, and also for comparing the expressiveness of languages, which was actually one of the original uses. But more recently, actually Abate et al. Came up with a different idea. So what if we express the security of compilers as in terms of hyperproperties? And in particular, they came up with the idea of robust compilation. And so they formalized the security with hyperproperties, which are sets of execution traces. So one of their criterion is the robust hyperproperty preservation, which is written here. And it tells you that if you have a program P in blue here that satisfies an hyperproperty H under any source attacker, then it must be true that its compiled version, P compiled, satisfies a target version of this hyperproperty under any target attacker. And what's the target version of the source hyperproperty is tau of H, and where tau is a map that translates the source hyperproperty into a target one, taking care of the differences in the observables in the traces. And since you can think of different classes of hyperproperties to preserve, you can actually apply this principle to preserve data integrity, data confidentiality, or even observational determinism, or even all this kind of stuff altogether. And the nice thing here is that you have a precise way of telling which hyperproperties are preserved, and in particular that they are preserved against adversarial, potentially active attackers. So it seems that we are presented of a choice to have fully abstract or to have robust compilation. And the question is, okay, which one do we prefer? Which one do we choose? And let's try to give an answer, and let's try to see why this is not probably the right question. So to give a satisfactory answer, we need to compare the guarantees that we have on the particular kind of compiled, on the compiled programs, which particular kind of hyperproperties we have, right? So the question becomes, if we get some program P that enjoys some security guarantee, what about the program P compiled? And well, it's rather easy to see that for robust compilers, the compiled program satisfies actually the same hyperproperty. So we have in some sense the same guarantee in the target as in the source. However, in FAC, so in fully abstract compilation, we don't have that in general, right? Because we don't express the security as hyperproperties, so we don't actually know how this notion of contextual equivalence is transformed when moving from the source to the target language. And actually, there are a few ad hoc examples in the literature that show that fully abstract compilers may not preserve security guarantees, interesting security guarantees that are enjoyed by the source. And in the next slide, I will show you one. And in particular, what we discovered is that in general, and this is from what we dubbed episode 1, which is which we presented last year at PriSC, and also which we presented at Atlas last year. But is the fact that fully abstract compilers actually preserve some hyperproperty, and we can exactly characterize that hyperproperty, but this is usually not easy to compute. So actually, there's a function which is not computable, but also this hyperproperty is not necessarily meaningful. For instance, non-interference at the source may not be mapped to non-interference at the target, and it may also be a trivial hyperproperty. So at the target, your target compiled program satisfies an hyperproperty, which is, for instance, the hyperproperty that is satisfied by any target program. So let's go to the example, so to have a more concrete idea of what's going on. And let's consider this function here to be the identity compiler, and assume that in the source we just have empty contexts. So we don't have contexts at the source. In the target instead, we have a spatial context, which is this spatial red bracket here, that takes a program P, and if that program emits an observable S, which is different from the club symbol, then it simply execute that program. So if P goes to P prime, then in the context, P goes to P prime. Instead, if P produces the club symbol and goes to P prime, then when P is plugged into the spatial context, the whole program terminates. So it goes to the spatial configuration bottom. And it is rather easy to see that this compiler does not preserve non-termination. So if we take a program that does not terminate at the source, for instance, one that emits the club symbol indefinitely, and this program does not terminate under any source context, once compiled via the identity compiler, this program terminates under this new spatial context, because it emits the club symbol and the compiled program terminates. However, the compiler is FAC, since traces of partial programs are equality between traces of partial programs is preserved. Okay, so now that we have this overview of both approaches, one may ask, okay, what's the best approach then? And the real point is, does this counterexample mean that we should forget completely about full abstraction? And the answer is, well, no. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here talking to you about full abstraction or robust compilation. But the fact is that robust compilation gives you explicit guarantees about which kind of hyperproperty of source hyperproperties are preserved. But full abstract compilers have many other positive things. For instance, full abstract compilers actually in the wild actually preserve many, but maybe not all, but many hyperproperties. And also, if your if your programming language has no traces or has no observable events in its semantics, you may be it may be better to consider the security of these programs using equivalences rather than traces or observables. And finally, there's a lot of existing work, for instance, proof techniques in full abstract compilers as opposed to robust compilation, although things are changing like the last talk by Akram. So what we would like to have is a combination of these two approaches. And ideally, we would like to have the benefits of both robust and full abstract compilation. And to do that, we first need to have an abstract view of our programming languages. So the idea is to start with a source programming language in blue, a target programming language in red, and a compiler between the two, and to abstractly specify them as follows. We define a syntax functor and a behavior functor, and these two functors together form Jesus, what's called Jesus rules, and actually abstractly this is called distributive laws, that are a way of specifying languages abstractly. So for instance, you get this, I know you can't read this, but it should be, let's say, intuitive enough to see that this is a simple while language specified according to this format. And you have a collection of these rules, and in this way, you specify your language, in particular, its operational semantics. And if you do the same at the target, so again, with these red rules, you get the specification of your source and target. Now you need an abstract specification of your compiler, and for that, you need to provide a map between the two. And this map is described via two natural transformations, S and B. And the nice thing about this stuff is that the following first fact by Zampas et al. And sorry, but from now on, I will be very informal and imprecise to keep things simple and to simplify my life, actually. But the first fact is the following: if you take a program P that is compiled to P blue, that is compiled to P red, and if you take a step on the operation, the source operational semantics, so you go from P to P prime and you emit an observable E, and you do the same at the target. If that's true that E blue and E red are linked together by the tau map that we have seen before for robust compilation, and it is also true that P prime is the compiled version of P prime, and this whole condition is called MODL, maps of distributive laws. And on top of that, you add that you have no internal non-determinism on your languages, then it is true that the compiler is a fully abstract compiler, roughly. But again, this is a fully abstract compiler, so it may still not robustly preserve interesting hyperproperties. So the point here is what's missing, and the fact is that contextual equivalence is a congruence, so we don't need an explicit notion of context in this case to add full abstraction, but we need an explicit notion of context to deal with robust hyperproperty satisfaction. So we need to make sure that target contexts are modeled, and in particular, we need to make sure, so you have a source context and target context, and you need to make sure that these are representables in an abstract way. And in particular, for us, we use functors again. So we have context functors and for the source and context functors for the target. And also you need a way of tying them together. So you need to tie target context to source context. And perhaps unsurprisingly, this is done via natural transformation, T, that in some sense represents, well, not in some sense, that represents a back translation, like the one that Akram presented before. So this was what's missing, so let's put everything together. And to put everything together, let's take again our behavior functor B, sorry, our natural transformation B that maps behavior functors into behavior functors. Then let's take again our syntax as before, and now let's enrich that with context. So we now have this configuration here. We have a syntax plus context functors at the source, syntax plus context functor at the target with two transformations, S and T, plus a natural transformation B that maps behavior functors at the source that also tell you something about context functors at the source into behavior functors at the target that also tells you something about context functors at the target. So what's now? And well, you may have imagined the key result. So the key result, again, very informally, is that if you take the same hypothesis as before, so MODL plus no internal determinism, but now you add some additional constraint that intuitively ensures that a given target context target contexts are no more expressive than source contexts, then you get a nice theorem. So the point is the following. If you take a context CT in red, so target context, and program P in blue, which is a source program, and you perform again a step on the blue program, emitting E1, and then you back translate the target context, so you get CT in red that goes to a CS in blue, and you link the partial program P prime to the source context, to the back translated source context CS, and from there you execute everything, you get a trace which is something like E1 followed by E2. If instead you execute the blue program, so you do the same thing as before, but now instead of back translating, you translate the trace. So E1, the trace produced by P is E1 and is translated through the map tau. You move again to CT P prime, and there you interpret, you execute actually the target context in the target semantics. Then you get something like tau of E1 followed by E2 in red, which is the execution of CT. And if here it is true that the blue traces are linked to the red trace and to the transformed trace via tau, and we express this, we call this hypothesis MMODL, which is multiple layer map of distributive laws, because now we have multiple layers which express our contexts. Then if that's true, then the compiler is both FAC and RC. So let's try to be a bit more concrete and using an example. Let's use the same example as before, with a spatial club detecting context, so the red one. But now we try to fix the compiler, and we fix that by adding a new target sandbox in which all compiled programs are. Yes, I will finish in time. Yeah, I still have a slide or two. So if we sandbox everything, and we sandbox our target programs, and so our sandbox simply inhibits the club symbol into a tau, and if this is sorry, I lost the point. Okay, if we did like that, we have that the compiler is still FAC as before. Equiterminating programs go to equiterminating programs, but now the compiler is also RC because the target context cannot make additional observation on target programs with respect to the source. So concluding, I guess I'm a bit over time. What we did is a comparison between fully abstract and robust compilers. And what we discovered is that the comparison is not really helpful. So what we did is to provide a novel criterion, which is abstract, and which in some sense subsumes both full abstraction and robust compilation. There's a lot of additional stuff in the paper, so go and read it. And some ongoing work is in place. In particular, Stelios is working on an academic mechanization of what I presented, plus some more stuff. And that's it. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any question.
Thanks, Matteo. Let's take questions. Do we have anything in the in-person audience? About online questions? Good. Well, if we don't have any questions, maybe let's just thank Matteo again